I've been approached by a university graduate who wants help preparing for their Royal Marines Commando training. They're physically fit, having passed the potential Royal Marines course, but they've been told they need to work on their mindset and mental robustness in the 32 weeks ahead. The problem is he doesn't know how to develop the necessary attitudes, beliefs and behaviours which would constitute him as mentally tough. According to the Royal Marines website, it takes a certain state of mind to become a Royal Marines Commando. Maddie identified that there's currently a disruptively high attrition rate in the Special Forces, with a growing number of recruits unable to make it through Special Forces training. And as is clear from this quote, stress is going to be a key factor that my client's going to need to be able to overcome if they're going to be successful in their career. What is stress? So, Anderson and Gustavberg identified that performing in professional environments requires individuals to make split-second decisions under physical and mental fatigue, underpinned by the knowledge that their decisions will have consequences of risk or reward. As such, at the end of the Second World War, the military wanted to know how they could select recruits to be stress resistant and train them to be able to deal with the stresses of the military environment. And this led to several definitions of stress being created, two of which we have here. All of these stress definitions are similar or subtly different, but they all have this similar characteristic, which is this person-environment transaction. And the concept behind that is that no two people appraise stress in the same manner. And as such, the experience of stress must therefore be assessed on a discrete individual basis. So my client wants to develop their mental robustness in the 32 weeks ahead, and I originally looked to see if they could develop their mental toughness. So mental toughness is having the natural or developed psychological edge that enables you to generally cope better than your opponents with the many demands that sport places on a performer, and specifically be more consistent and better than your opponent in remaining determined, focused, confident and in control under pressure. But what's clear from this definition is that virtually any positive psychological trait associated with sporting performance could be defined as mental toughness. And as such, Jones argued that this concept lacks conceptual clarity, and Golby and Sherd argued that it has insufficient discriminative power when it comes to assessing the link between psychological and physiological performance gains. Furthermore, as it's such a complex construct, it would be hard to adequately assess, prescribe and implement an intervention strategy in the short period of time that I have. As a result, I've decided to focus on a concept which has a more widely accepted definition and method of assessment, and that concept is hardiness. So hardiness was first identified by Kobasa in 1979 following a study into the effects of stress on health. And she discovered that high scores on a life stress inventory did not necessarily correlate with high levels of stress. And when investigating the moderating factors behind this concept, Kobasa identified that those who perceived change as a challenge rather than a threat were much less likely to report symptoms of stress. And this led to Kobasa defining hardiness as formed of three interrelated dispositional beliefs. So firstly, challenge, that change is a challenge rather than a threat. Control, so the idea that you can influence your environment. And commitment, the tendency to feel as if you can find meaning and in whatever you're doing. And Golby and Sherd identified that having these hardy attitudes decreases your likelihood of stress-related physical or mental illness by leading to hardy behaviours. These include hardy coping, hardy social interactions and hardy self-care. And these behaviours all buffer the effects of stress by equipping the individual better with the resources to cope with that stress. And these improvements are achieved through transformational coping, which is an active, decisive mindset, rather than regressive coping, which is denial and avoidance in the face of stressful circumstances. And furthermore, hardiness has been found to be negatively correlated with post-traumatic stress disorder, but in Vietnam veterans by King et al., who found that those who were high on hardiness were much less likely to report symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, as they had the social support to cope with that stress in that environment. So Heisted et al. Wanted to study whether hardness could predict admission to military training schools. And they studied a military training officer programme and asked the officer applicants to complete a questionnaire containing dispositional hardness measures. And they found that successful applicants were significantly or had significantly higher hardness than unsuccessful applicants. And in a logistical regression, they found that hardness significantly predicted admission to the military training school. So they found an odds ratio of 1.065, which indicates that for every 1 point increase on the hardness scale, they had an increased chance of being admitted into the military training school of 6.5%. And that's an increase or an improvement on the results of Barton et al.'s 2008 study, which found an odds ratio of 1.033 in a US military programme. So that dispels any arguments that have been made that Barton et al.'s findings were not culturally generalisable. So Risker argued that Barton et al.'s study, as it was conducted in the US, where hardness is culturally encouraged, the results wouldn't be generalisable to more egalitarian cultures such as Scandinavian cultures, but these results by Heisted et al. Disprove that theory. These results, however, need to be taken with some caution. In both studies, the average difference between successful and unsuccessful applicants was just around 1 point. And this points to one of two conclusions. So either hardness as a construct isn't very stable, or the measures currently used to assess hardness are not accurate and in-depth enough. So one suggestion to improve the reliability of this measure has been to use multiplicative scoring rather than additive scoring, as hardness measures or variables are integrative, and so by using multiplicative scoring, you create a larger score which is more easily defined into categories. So further research has also supported this role of hardness in military personnel. Barton et al. Identified isolation, ambiguity, powerlessness, boredom and danger as stresses specific to the military environment, and workload was added at a later date to reflect the increased deployment rate in the US military. And in response to these military stresses being identified, Dolan and Adler identified came up with the concept of military hardness, which is the context-specific adaptation of psychological hardness and measures the degree to which military personnel feel committed to, challenged by, and in control of their work experiences in the military. So Skomorski and Sudum hypothesized that military-specific hardness would be a better predictor of psychological well-being than general hardness. And they studied Canadian Air Force trainees for their levels of general and military hardness. And they found that although general hardness predicted life satisfaction, military-specific hardness predicted psychological well-being and perceptions of basic training. And in particular, the military commitment subscale predicted satisfaction, health symptoms, and training satisfaction above general hardness. Again, there were some issues with this research, though. So in an ideal research situation, all trainee applicants would be hired and assessed on their hardness measures. But in this study, the hardness data was only available for those who had already passed the Canadian Forces Aptitude Test. So this means that they had already been partly pre-selected on their cognitive abilities. On top of this, the recruits were tested on their hardness whilst already undergoing basic training. And as the longitudinal stability of hardness isn't currently known, it could be that their hardness scores were already being influenced by the stresses of that military training environment. But despite these limitations and the limitations of the previous study by Heisted et al., I'd argue that the results point to hardness being an important selection criterion and also an important element to incorporate into basic training, but you need to make sure that you examine hardness data before the recruit starts training to assess the longitudinal effects of hardness. There's been some debate as to whether hardness can be taught or whether it's a constant state-like characteristic. So hardness training was initially implemented by Koshaba and Maddy in response to the Illinois Bell Company, asking them to help their managers deal with the newly competitive environment. And the results of the initial hardness training found that the experimental group had large increases in their hardy attitudes, reduced perception of stress and lowered blood pressure. And these increased hardy attitudes were maintained 6 months post-intervention. So that's pretty compelling evidence that hardiness can be taught. But what does hardiness training involve? So as per the guidelines put forth in the Hardy Training Workbook by Kushaba and Maddie, coping responses are encouraged through 3 processes. So firstly, situational reconstruction. This is where the client is encouraged to rethink through a stressful situation that they've been part of in the past and reassess that situation and see how that situation could have been better dealt with from a place where they're not stressed out. Secondly, focusing. So this is where the client is asked to identify the bodily sensations associated with stress so that they're better able to identify when they're stressed in the future. And finally, compensatory self-improvement. So this is ask the client to identify a stressful situation that they can't necessarily be in control of at this time, and instead take on a new challenge which they're likely to succeed at in order to reassure them that they can cope with stressful situations. And then there's a social support component of hardiness training where the trainee is asked to improve their social networks in order to have a better social environment to help them with stress in the future. So what will my intervention involve? My intervention will involve the trainee carrying out the military hardness scale and the personal views survey too before they start their training in order to provide a baseline level of hardness. Then in the 6 weeks leading up to their hardness training, their basic training, they will carry out some hardness training. So Hasel et al. And Maddie suggest that hardness training can be effective with anywhere between 6 and 12 weeks of training. And it's important that the recruit is taught how to employ these hardness techniques before they go into basic training, as it's more of a preventative technique. And as the recruit will be in training for 32 weeks, I'll start hardness training 6 weeks before they go to Limpstone. And this will involve 1 2-hour session a week where they are taught these hardiness intervention techniques. And these techniques are often referred to as the fingers of the hardiness hand. So hardy coping, social support, relaxation, nutrition and exercise. And I will focus on the first 3 of these in my hardiness intervention, as the other 2 will be out of my client's control once they get into basic training. So after their 6 weeks of hardness training, they'll go into their 32 weeks of basic training, and they'll be encouraged to practice and employ the hardness techniques on their training experiences. And I will ask them to keep a diary to document the stresses that they encounter and use situational reconstruction and also focusing to reflect on those and see how they can deal with them better in the future. And I'll know if my intervention has worked, as they will have improvements in their hardness scores post the hardness training intervention and also post their basic training. But there will be some potential obstacles and moderators that I need to consider. Firstly, time. So once in military training, my client will not be able to dictate their own schedule, and this might mean that they find it difficult to find the time to employ their hardness techniques in their training. And so we might find that they lack the motivation to carry out their training, and thus their hardy attitude slip. But I'm hoping that the diary that I've asked them to use will act as a prompt and remind them to keep employing their hardiness techniques. Secondly, controllability or replicability of the environment. So when doing hardiness training, my client will be in a quiet, private environment, but this won't be replicable once they're in their basic training. So I need to remind or encourage my clients to persevere with their hardy techniques and get them to understand that whilst it might be hard at first to employ their techniques, they need to persevere and then they should find them useful. Finally, individual differences. So while some people might find it easy to learn hardiness and buy into the concept of psychological training, others might not see the point in it and might not have the motivation to put the effort in to see improvements. But I would argue that as my client has approached me specifically, they should have the motivation to put that work in to see those improvements in their mental robustness. So overall, the personality style of hardness appears to be highly relevant for the military training environment and selection. And this tendency should not only increase my clients' readiness to learn and develop in training, but should also make them better equipped to cope with the demanding and stressful military environment. And this should reduce their likelihood of dropping out of military training and set them up well to thrive in their military career. Thank you for listening. Do you have any questions?